This video contains spoilers for Xenoblade Chronicles, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torna, the Golden Country. I recently replayed through Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Torna, the Golden Country, and let me tell you, it was an enlightening experience. The first time I played through Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was in 2018, and while I did enjoy it in many respects, there were things that bothered me. Mostly that it was very complicated, and I wasn't sure if I didn't understand it because I was dumb, or because the game was poorly designed. And now, 2 years later, I'm back to report that it was a bit of both. So now that I've played through this duology of video games twice, I feel slightly more prepared to discuss the intricacies of its systems. It's kind of just too complicated in general, specifically in regards to character management. Character management is a pretty big part of the game, and the problem is I just don't find it that enjoyable. It's okay, but there are just so many different things to keep track of. Here are some of the things you have to keep in mind while playing just off the top of my head. Blade selection, taking into account stats, movesets, and elemental types. Poppy management, taking into account the minigame and separate upgrade menu. Driver skill trees. Blade weapon chip. Blade skill trees. Shotgun item. And all of these systems are not very well introduced by the game's tutorials, of which there are many. You have to take into account about 12 different party members at any given time, individually tend to their gear, which isn't even including the other 8 party members that you aren't using at the time, or the multitude of blades that are not currently in use. It's too much. It's also not clear which of it is vital and which of it is not. You don't technically have to do all of it, but most of them are mandatory to some degree, and it's not really clear what is and isn't necessary to do. It's not just that there's a lot of things, it's that many of these things don't feel like they need to be there, and the game would be better off without their inclusion. Blade management is sort of like a less fun version of Pokemon, except you get the Pokemon from unpaid loot boxes. Why would you put that in your game? Yeah, just getting blades and managing them is just not a great experience. And I think that's one thing that Torna does a lot better than the main game, is that you don't have to deal with these tens of different blades that you can unlock and figure out which one to use and when. I just don't want to do that. The side quests are passable, but they aren't really all that interesting. This is important because in Torna, the game's prologue, the side quests take up about 40% of the entire game. I just really struggle to care about these side quests at all. I think side quests can be really good. For example, The Witcher 3 has some really great side quests. They're actually fun to complete. They have interesting little stories. They're fully voice acted. They have consequences. They make sense contextually in the world. But the ones in Xenoblade, they're just kind of boring. I mean, they're not terrible, but I'd much rather be doing almost anything else. And then there's the battle system, which can be fun, but it actually takes a long time to unlock the features which make the battle system enjoyable. So for the first 20 hours, you feel really restricted, especially playing through it again, because the first time through, you're kept engaged just by learning the basics of it. But when I played it through the second time, I knew that there was more to the system that makes it more fun, but it's locked behind many hours of story progress. And that's annoying, and it just makes the early game feel really slow. The story also doesn't pick up till quite a few hours in, so you pair that with the battle system, which is really drawn back in the beginning hours, and the game just starts out a bit dull. I do vaguely enjoy all the various battle mechanics, like the combo systems, where you can pull off combos by using various attack art types. You have break, topple, launch, smash, which you chain together to do more damage, which also combine with the elemental attacks, which are the other side of it. You charge these up by using the attack arts, and then you use the elemental attacks in a specified order to get various different effects. So there's these different things to keep track of, and they're fairly engaging once you unlock all of them, but for the start you're kind of just stuck pressing buttons, and it's a bit monotonous and not amazing. The exploration is fairly enjoyable. The environments are quite large and have a fair amount of detail to them. We have the characters. There's a lot of cool ones. There's Amalthus, he's sort of the main villain, and they give him a fair amount of backstory, and I like him. He's pretty cool. We have Jin, who is one of the central characters in Torna the Golden Country, and one of the main antagonists in the main game. I do think that the way they resolve his character is ever so slightly flawed, but overall it does still land pretty well. Malos is one of the other main villains. Yeah, so basically Malos is corrupted by Amalthus's influence, which is why he's a pretty dangerous dude, which is thematically appropriate and works pretty nicely. I really don't like Tora. He's your Nopon companion, comparable to Ricky from the original Xenoblade Chronicles, and he's a lot worse than Ricky. He has a few decent moments, but other than that, not a lot to like. Rex is actually possibly my favorite of the Xenoblade Chronicles protagonists. He is by far the most flawed, and his voice actor does not always deliver, especially early in the game. There are a lot of strange decisions that just don't work. But later in the game, he has some pretty great moments, and I think overall is pretty convincing a majority of the time. Pyra is pretty decent. Mithra has some good moments, but I find her kind of goddamn annoying. Especially in Torna, she's really horrible in Torna. And I get that it's a deliberate choice to make this character kind of annoying, but it goes a bit overboard and just ends up with her being totally unlikable most of the time. Zeke is alright. The way he's introduced is not the best. He's sort of a Team Rocket character for some reason, but then he becomes a party member. It's not amazing, really, but it turns out okay. Nia is pretty good. She's likable enough throughout and has sufficient character depth. Morag is also a pretty solid character, not super notable, but she's alright. Laura is a decent protagonist in Torna the Golden Country. She's not as developed as the other Xenoblade Chronicles protagonists, but that makes sense given that the game she is in is far shorter. But even still, the character is quite functional and well done. Gort is a really great character in Torna. He's sort of a secondary villain, and his character is pretty well done, and he becomes quite frightening. Jesus Christ. The character designs are quite mixed. Some of them look pretty good, but a lot of them are really over-designed and frankly a bit hideous. I hate looking at this thing. It's very ugly. What is this? Okay, this is definitely a tangent, but I'd say it's one that's worth going on. I really like this game's dub. I think it's pretty great. I have not listened to the original Japanese voice track, largely just because I enjoy what the dub brings to the game. You have lots of funny accents, which is something that I like. The reason I'm bringing this up, though, is because this game is very good at giving its characters their own associated accents, which is kind of neat, especially when you look at some other Nintendo games and other video games in general, where they kind of just ignore that, and some people are British and some people are American for no reason. I'm sure a lot of people don't care about this stuff, but I myself find it quite interesting. So then, in terms of the human races, we have the Tantalese, Leftherian, and Tornan, all of whom have English accents. Morardane have Scottish accents. The Gormati cat people have Welsh accents. The Urians are Australian. And the Indal Society have American accents. And I just think that that's cool and pretty noteworthy. This level of attention to detail in the accents was something I caught onto on my first playthrough, but it was something that I was able to appreciate far more the second time through. And I just really like stuff like that because it makes the world feel a lot more believable than it would have if characters were just haphazardly assigned accents. It's just something to keep in mind. And now, it's Torna time. Torna the Golden Country was released as DLC for the main game, and it tells the story of the country of Torna 500 years before the events of the main campaign. It is pretty essential for the storytelling, as it establishes and delves into characters, and it just provides a lot of context for what happens later. And the experience of playing Torna is, in a lot of ways, superior to that of the main game. The smaller party size is far easier to manage. The battle system is far more fast and fluid and just generally more fun. Unfortunately, what really does drag it down though is the pacing. There are 2 different instances in the game where your progress is gated behind your community level, which is this menu where you recruit characters by completing side quests, and you have to do several hours of this before you can progress further in the story. And this is kind of annoying because the side quests are not very fun, and it's really just blatant padding because it adds 5 hours to the total playtime, which otherwise would be 7 hours without it. And so it's understandable, but the execution of it is pretty flawed. And it really is a shame that they messed up that specific aspect, because apart from that, it is just generally better and a smoother experience than the main campaign. Okay, back to the main video game. Oh yeah, the music. Wow! I like Xenoblade 1's music, but the overall sound presentation in 2 is far more impressive and ambitious. The increased amount of orchestration adds a lot in particular. I absolutely love the music in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. It contains some of my favorite video game songs of all time. Seriously, there's just so much amazing stuff here. The visuals look pretty good despite the 720p resolution. I was surprised by how much better it looks than Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. The fact that 2 was built from the ground up for the Switch specifically does show, cause it looks a lot better. Okay, and now the big thing really is the story, because there's like 10 hours of cutscenes in this game, and I actually like them. They're really good. There's some very great moments. It does start out slow, like I previously mentioned, and a lot of the early plot points do feel a bit like filler. Pretty much anything involving Chairman Bana is not that great. After the first quarter of the game, it does pick up and gets increasingly better. Now for this playthrough of these 2 games, I did something the executive director recommended. In an interview, he said that originally, the events of Torna the Golden Country played out between chapters 7 and 8 of the main game. But they had to cut it, I guess because they just didn't have time, and opted to make it a DLC campaign instead. But by playing Torna the Golden Country after finishing chapter 7 and before starting chapter 8, you can sort of get this original intended experience. And it's a pretty unique way of playing it. I've never really done that before with a game. It did mess a bit with the pacing, especially during the portions of Torna where you have to do endless side quests. That really didn't work well because the story in the main game is really picking up at this point. And so then you have to go back to Torna, where a lot of what you have to do is pretty monotonous and not that fun. And you kind of just want to get back to the main game after a certain point. But I wanted to finish Torna first, and in order to do that, I had to do all these side quests. It did make several of the character payoffs in the later chapters of the main campaign far more satisfying than they would have otherwise been, as many central characters have vital development which takes place in Torna, most especially Jin. The ending of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is fucking insane. The cutscene in which the architect explains the nature of reality in Ulrest is really well done, and it just comes together so well. I love almost everything about the ending. I love Moritha, how it's a post-apocalyptic world that takes place parallel to the original Xenoblade Chronicles. I like how when you get to the world tree, you're like, oh, this is a weird space station. And then you go up the world tree and Amalthus does some crazy stuff. Basically all the villains die in pretty interesting ways. And then Pyra dies, sort of. And then not really. That came out pretty well. You can really feel Rex's emotion here. He looks sad. He sounds sad. The music, oh my god, it sounds so good. It's actually impeccable. It's pretty wild. The first time going through it was pretty insane because I hadn't really played a game with that level of depth in its world building. And it was quite breathtaking to behold. And I still very much enjoyed it on replay. By the way, how are they going to make Xenoblade Chronicles 3? I don't know where you go from here. I don't know how you could top this. Very excited to see how they tackle that. Okay, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, top level thoughts. It overall has more flaws than the original Xenoblade, which is a more consistently enjoyable experience, especially when taking into account the improvements made in Definitive Edition. There are just too many systems, poorly introduced mechanics, the battle system takes a long time to actually get good, blade management is just not that fun in my experience. I still love this game though, despite all of its problems. It has a lot to offer, it's very unique, there's some beautiful moments. It's pretty strange, not all of it works. There's a decent chance you won't be able to connect with it, but if it does connect with you, it's a pretty great experience. I really enjoyed revisiting Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and its prequel, Torna the Golden Country, as it gave me a more concrete understanding of what these games' strengths are and where they falter. While I don't think that these games are perfect, I do think that there are so many great elements in them that I really enjoy and connect with. And I think that if you are able to connect with this game, it is pretty special and there is nothing else quite like it. So I'm very glad that I replayed it, and I'm really pleased to have been able to discuss it further than I have previously. It's been a real treat to delve back into this duology of games and dissect them a little bit in my mind and in video form. That's gonna have to do it. I will see you later. Bye.